Right, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, welcome to a very substantial audience here this evening, and also a very substantial audience online for this, the Michaelmas term in a Temple History Society lecture. The folk online, if I could just say this, that if you have any questions at the end, you could use you have to log into your YouTube account and type in the question there, and we have a member of staff who will ask the question on your behalf if there's time. The object of these lectures is, or has been, to highlight the great men and women who have made a solid contribution to the common law and to advance the rule of law. And the Inns of Court have made a tremendous contribution to the civilized world by their courage in pursuing both the rule of law and establishing the rules of the common law. It's important, therefore, that we know of them, and the history lectures will tell us about those. This evening, we have a talk about two of them, one a member of this inn, the other a member of Gray's Inn. The member of this inn, of course, is Edward Cook, and Edward Cook is curiously rather better known, perhaps in the United States, than he is here. On the doors of the Supreme Court of the United States, there's a bas relief showing Edward Cook. And there is nothing of the kind that I know of here. The other great man who will be spoken of is of Gray's Inn. And Gray's have thought it appropriate to have a statue of him. Now, I don't know whether that was of the time before he was convicted of bribery, but he was nevertheless a towering figure, and we will learn much more of him this evening from our speaker. The rivalry between the two of them was extreme. In a time of turmoil and political shenanigans, which frequently led to an unhappy outcome. What can be said of both of them is they both actually managed to die in their own beds, which in the period was quite an achievement. The speaker this evening is the Right Honourable Jessie Norman MP, who has written this excellent book on the rivalry between the two of them. I would, if you haven't had a chance to read it, I would absolutely commend it to you. It makes for surprisingly compelling reading, and that says much to his style of presentation. So his publisher tells us of Jessie that he is the MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire, and he still is. He was Financial Secretary to the Treasury between 2019 and 2021. He managed the UK furlough scheme for the pandemic. So between him and his wife, they more or less saved the country because his wife managed the wonderful vaccination scheme, where we would have been without the two of them, heavens alone knows. Before entering politics, Jessie worked in the charitable sector, worked as a director of Barclays Bank, and was educated at Oxford University, and then saw the light and took an MPhil and a doctorate at University College London, which is much to be commended. He's an honorary fellow at St Andrews University and a fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. Jesse is, so I'm told, the author of 2 acclaimed works, and that I'm sure they are, because this other book we've been discussing has been highly acclaimed since its publication. So, Jesse, over to you. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Donald, for that fantastically generous, if slightly ambiguous in places introduction. It's an absolute delight to be here and very, very lovely to see you all. And thank you very much indeed for coming out on a Monday evening to listen to an old-fashioned story of political rivalry, skullduggery, intrigue, revenge, and betrayal. I feel a particular joy to be here, not just out of my reverence for the Inner Temple and the Inns of Court in general, which I say the third university when Oxford and Cambridge were trying to get themselves or continuing to get themselves into a position of unchallenged oligopoly for 600 years, but also because my beloved father-in-law, Tom Bingham, himself a bencher at Gray's Inn, taught me more than anyone could ever have imagined about the rule of law. So I'm enormously grateful to you, Donald, thank you, and to Celia Pilkington and anyone else who's made this talk possible. And I'm extremely aware, I should say also, of the exceedingly august audience, both in the room and online. And in particular, I want to pick out and thank my friend and venerated assistant on this book, John Baker, who is in the room. And John has forgotten more about the development of the common law than I will ever learn if I started it now and did so for the rest of my life. And it is an absolute sense of kind of reverence that I thank him, and he was incredibly helpful with this book. That being the case, any errors should be addressed to him at the Inner Temple, because I'm pleased to say, actually, there have 1 or 2 tiny errors in the hardback edition have been silently corrected for the paperback, but otherwise, actually, the reaction was remarkably good. And one of the supreme accolades that I've had was when someone who I had been talking with mentioned that, who was a professor at Oxford of 16th century political history, said that it had been put on the reading list. The Winding Stair had been put on the reading list for incoming history undergraduates. That gave me a great sense of joy. Okay, so so this is the book. Here it is. Why the name? Well, you will, I'm sure, being an Inner Temple audience, instantly get the reference, which is to Bacon's essay of Great Place, where he says, all rise into great place is by a winding stair. So we think of the greasy pole now as our favoured metaphor for ambition and public failure or success. But for Bacon, classically, as you might imagine, a man of extraordinarily interesting and independent cast of mind, he thinks of it as a winding stair from which a person could go backwards, go forwards, go sideways, if it winds, and even possibly fall off. And the book opens, and I say this with a degree of, just as a caveat emptor, with a frontispiece that says, this is a novel. Much of it is made up. Almost all of it is true. Any resemblance to actual persons and events, past or present, is unlikely to be coincidental. Now, let's go to the action. Where are we? We're in the period 1590, roughly, to 1625. Now, cast your mind back to that time, and I'm willing to bet most audiences, probably not in a Temple audience, that the one historically notable event or non-event that you will think of, actually shortly to be commemorated, is the attempt to destroy the House of Commons and decapitate the entire Parliament and monarchy and senior aristocracy and almost everyone else of Britain in 1605 by Guy Fawkes. But otherwise, this is, in historical terms, often treated by academics as something of an orphan time. It's nothing like as much fun as the Tudors in their pomp, whether it's Henry VIII, Henry VII doesn't get much work in, Henry VIII and the Reformation and all of the shenanigans of his wives and marriages and religious struggles, or, of course, Elizabeth. When you get to 1588 and the Spanish Armada, interest starts to peter out, and it only really gets going again in 1625 when James dies and Charles, his son, becomes king, because at that point the appetite of the audience is whetted by the thought that although there's a quite tedious period of some 17 years of personal rule and a bit of religious conflict, shortly you'll be into the solid red meat of the Wars of Three Kingdoms or the English Civil Wars or whatever you want to call them, and after which tremendous further fun is to be had. So 1590 to 1625, in historical terms, something of an orphan time. Not, however, if you are a specialist in English literature. If you're interested in English literature, it's the absolutely golden age. It is the moment of Marlowe and Shakespeare and Donne and Johnson and Herbert, and if in the theatre, Kidd and Middleton and all these other extraordinary figures. It's the moment where human language explodes in a completely unexpected way and becomes something not just in of itself extraordinary for its works, but completely shaping of a whole sensibility. And of course, in this context, it would be wrong not to mention the King James Bible as a work of literature, which has, and of course Tyndale's Bible before that, massively, as it were, incorporated, but then supercharged and given additional life and prominence. And so it's a remarkable time. Now, one of the fun things about writing this book, which is in form a novel, although, as I've said, for reasons we can come to, quite historically based, is that it allows you to do things that you could never do in an academic book. So one of the fun things I've done in this novel is it doesn't have any words in it after the year 1699. Okay? It is a work entirely constructed in the language of the Stuarts, broadly speaking, and the Tudors before them. And that has a remarkably interesting conditioning effect. It actually forces the writer to start to think in these very lapidary, monosyllabic, kind of Elizabethan terms. And I hope it makes it more fun to read. I can tell you it made a hell of a lot of fun to write. But so that is the moment we're at, 1590, 1625 roughly. And what is the state of the nation? Well, Elizabeth is nearing the end of her reign. She's been on the throne for 32 years at this point. Her chief minister is, well, at the outset of it, it's kind of moving. There's a changing of the guard. Hatton has gone, and Leicester has gone, and but Burghley remains. And of course, Burghley brings his son, Robert Cecil, into the fray as well by the end of the period. And then, by the end of the 1590s. And then, so Elizabeth is tight. She's tight on the money, she's controlling of her parliaments, and she is suspicious and peevish about handing out favour and worried about religious tension and provoking it, and determined to steer a kind of middle course. And she has surrounded herself with extremely able people, notably William Cecil, Lord Burghley, as I've mentioned, and Robert, his son, but also Nicholas Bacon. And Nicholas Bacon, a fellow of a bench at Gray's Inn, is Burghley's brother-in-law, his best friend, and the father of Francis Bacon, or as we refer to him in the early parts of the book, Frank. Frank Bacon, but that's a different view. None of you ever thought of Francis Bacon as Frank Bacon, but that's how he's referred to in the family. So Francis Bacon, in the first instance, to start with one of our two heroes or anti-heroes, grows up in the bosom of the court. And his father is Lord Treasurer, and his uncle is Lord Keeper. His uncle is Lord Treasurer, and they are managing a lot of the business of the Queen. Of course, they are married to these very formidable Cook sisters, Anne and Mildred, alongside Queen Elizabeth herself, two of the most highly educated women in Europe. And this creates a kind of hothouse atmosphere for the young Frank and his older brother, Anthony Bacon. And the book has a kind of narrative arc which starts with that moment of Francis Bacon and then takes us through, introduces Cook and takes us through the travails of their rivalry. And throughout, you have to remember that the success of one is the disaster of the other. So there's a kind of mirroring going through the whole account. Now, let me just focus on Cook for a second. Cook, born 9 years before Bacon, is born in Norwich, or outside Norwich. Middle gentry family, sort of slightly lower in the pecking order than Francis. In many ways, they have rather a similar background. Francis is educated privately and then goes to Trinity, Cambridge. Cook goes to grammar school and then goes to Trinity. And then Cook goes to Clifford's Inn and then on to sainted haunts of the Inner Temple. And he makes his name very quickly in the law. So if you think, Cook 1552, by the time you get to 1580, Cook is making very solid headway. He's already recognized as, the phrase the oracle of the law comes in very early. He's making a lot of money doing transactions, in particular for the kind of East Anglian gentry and nobility, all these Howards and Gordys and people like that. And he then becomes Speaker of the House of Commons, 1591, and he's away, and very much adopted by the Cecils because they can see that he is a tough, hard-working man of business who knows the law better than anyone, and that's a very useful guy to have in your corner when you're trying to get business sorted and organized. So Cook relatively quickly becomes Solicitor General, becomes Attorney General. But he only does so after a prolonged battle in which the other contestant is the brilliant younger Francis Bacon. And Bacon enlists his great friend, or his patron, I should say, the Earl of Essex, to support him in this act. And there's a fantastic exchange between Essex and Robert Cecil as they're coming back, having been interrogating Lopez, who they suspected of poisoning the Queen. And Essex starts to probe Cecil on who he's supporting. And he said, "Know you that I am foursquare for Master Bacon?" And then and Cecil says, "Well, maybe these things need a little more, perhaps a person of slightly more greater digestion." And then Essex says, "Digest me, no digestions. It is Bacon I must have." And so Essex squarely thrusts himself and his not inconsiderable personal authority and prestige at court behind Bacon. And the thing drags on. You've got Cook preferred by the Cecils and Bacon not preferred by his own uncle and cousin, but being advanced by someone from a different quarter of the court altogether. And Cook wins. Cook becomes Attorney General. And then Francis is encouraged to think about Solicitor General. He doesn't even get that. So by the time you get to the end of the 1590s, Francis Bacon is watching Cook on an ever-ascending trajectory, as it appears, treading on his own dreams and capability, Francis Bacon is under no illusions about his own personal brilliance. He's always been informed of it. It's a kind of established fact at court that Francis Bacon is a brilliant young man, but he's not making it. And of course, if you set your heart, as he has, on a public career, and you are, as he is, ambitious, and you come from these very favoured circumstances, your uncle is the Lord Treasurer, your now at that point dead, but much revered father has been Lord Keeper. You know, you've got every expectation of preferment at the Tudor court, and he doesn't get it. And matters get worse in 1597, when it becomes clear that there is coming onto what is, I'm afraid, somewhat indelicately referred to as the marriage market in England, a woman who is at once generally regarded as the most beautiful, the richest, and the best connected woman in the country. And this is Eliza Hatton. And Eliza is herself a member of the Cecil clan. She's had a very prosperous first marriage to a man who gave her a lot of money and then died, as is the Elizabethan way. And so she finds herself being wooed by every imaginable semi-capable, non-demented, arthritic, rich, possibly elderly, young, horny, desperate, indebted man. And Francis Bacon at this point is very indebted and very much sets his cap at Lady Hatton. And then discovers to his absolute mortification that Edward Coke is doing exactly the same thing. Coke has had a very happy marriage to his first wife, Bridget Paston. They have lots of kids. She then dies, and no one expects the rather gruff and somewhat curmudgeonly, sort of rough around the edges Cook to be turning up and pitching for this duel of a match, but there he is. And guess what? Cook wins. So by the time you get to the end of the 1590s, there is already fermenting, I put it to you, a very, very healthy potential frustration, anger, and an embryonic rivalry between Bacon and the older man. And there is here, I have a Baconian sonnet in the book, which will give you a sense of his feelings. As you know, Bacon was a very accomplished writer. We have some of his poetry. We have an enormous amount of his epigrams and aphorisms, as well as the essays and many other works. And so this runs, it's to Lady H. Sweet love, 'tis true, I was not made for love. With you, e'en Euclid could not make more plain. Yet our twin nature's laws must move as one, and human custom thus disdain. Thou, Castor, I as Polydeuces stay, but as a comet if thou soar above and join another body for a day. Hie thee then back in spirit to my love. As older wine doth e'er mature the best when diverse grapes it brings in cast together, so shall our ancient love still stand the test when rougher winds conspire to strain its tether. In this fantastically Shakespearean final couplet, for love commingled none can separate, nor part of friendship so intrinsicate. So that gives you a sense of Francis's emotions at that particular moment, and the effect of his feeling shunned by the Cecils in authority, in control, has been to drive him closer and closer to the Earl of Essex. But Essex himself is a frustrated man who is desperate for more preeminence at court, and in particular to be the anointed successor to Burghley in the Queen's favour. And of course, he has a very different conception of what the role of a Queen's statesman should be. So for Burghley, as you know, it's about judicious management of an incredible volume of paper across a very elaborate court and governmental mechanism operating in and around and through the Privy Council. And and other bodies. But for Essex, it's about martial valor. It is about discharging the memories of Sir Philip Sidney or Earl of Leicester or others on the battlefield. And so he finds himself, he campaigns vigorously to go to Ireland in order to lead the army there, has a catastrophic kind of failure, mishap, comes back to England, as you may recall, ambushes the Queen in her privy apartments, is gently turned away, and then when the Queen's got her stuff together, essentially confined at house arrest. And this is not a great turn from the Baconian career advancement standpoint. This is not a great development, and it gets much worse when the Queen encourages, in fact, requires him to stand alongside Edward Coke in prosecuting Essex after Essex's abortive rebellion in 1601. All of this is covered in the book. So by 1601, Bacon has found himself completely alienated from the court, his in enormous debt, with no hope of preferment, and his patron head severed from its neck on the chopping block on Tower Hill. It's not a great outlook at that particular moment. And then you get the year 1603, the Queen dies, and James I comes to the throne. And it looks like this could be the moment. Everything is going to change, you might think. So James arrives, and let me, if I may, just read a little bit about the arrival of King James in his royal progress from Scotland down to London. The new king came to London, came slowly and in a great progress, scattering his bounty like rose petals at a wedding, filling men's mouths with gold and loading their backs with peerages and other titles. To him has fallen the joy of deciding who shall prosper and who shall not and who shall be brought low. The towns and cities have prostrated themselves before him in greeting, an inspection of 70 teams of horse and plough at Godmanchester, 100 men on stilts in Lincolnshire. This is all true, by the way. The king is strange to look at. Now, for some reason I'm not entirely clear about, when I wrote this, there was a suspicion that I was discussing or mentioning a contemporary political figure today, but I'll leave you to judge. The king is strange to look at. He has bulging, expressive eyes, a slobbering mouth, and an awkward gait. He dresses finely, yet somehow contrives to look ill-kempt. He speaks Scots with an accent, loves to drink ardent alcoholic spirits, and swears like a tavern brawler. Yet the king's true affections lie elsewhere. They say he has 3 addictions: to disputation, to hunting, and to Frenchified young men. And the great families of England are already ransacking their junior relatives to the uttermost, knowing that the king will never turn away a fair youth with a nice turn of phrase and a couple or 2 of good hounds. There is a sour hexameter that does the rounds. Rex fuit Elisabeth, nunc est regina Jacobus. Elizabeth was a king, now we have James as our queenie. So, this looks like it could be a great moment, and we now, and of course James comes, as I've said, there is an enormous expansion of favour. He is widely welcomed across England, and he loads people up with these marvellous titles and knighthoods. 300 men get knighted at a single moment. It's a general point about this book, by the way, that the men are all horrendous and the women are all rather marvellous. I think it's rather a fact, actually, about Tudor and Stuart England that's true, and you can see it actually if you look at the behind the scenes of the great men of the Civil War. So Anne Monk, George Monk's wife, or Anne Vere, who was Fairfax's wife, or Elizabeth Cromwell. These are all fantastic, high energy, very capable, strong women. James comes in and spreads his bounty everywhere. And that is designed to make up for the fact that actually he's bringing a lot of Scotsmen with him and putting them in senior positions in and around the court, which annoys everyone enormously. Let me just give you a few quick further developments to sketch the sense of what's happening. 1603, Bacon meets his wife, Alice Barnum. 3 years later, Edward Coke becomes Chief Justice, Common Pleas. And then 1608, finally, Bacon makes it to Solicitor General. He gets his foot at last, as he would say, 15 years too late, on the first step of the Winding Stair. And of course, that itself creates an incredible possibility for him, because Coke has become a judge. Coke is no longer the king's man of business. But he, Bacon, is now the Solicitor General. He is the king's man of business. And not only that, Coke's taken extremely seriously the injunction on judges that they should be independent-minded. And he's starting to exercise what is becoming seen certainly in the church and certainly at court as possessed of an alarming independence of mind. And an example of this, of course, is the case of prohibitions, where he almost physically comes to blow with the king over the question of, as it were, whether it's rex or lex that should be the senior source of authority in the kingdom. So Bacon can see that this translation of the two men has created the opportunity for him to advance further. How would you do that? You would do that by exploiting opportunities to drive wedges between the king and the judge in order to see if you couldn't ultimately just tap a little further and separate them all together. And you see this because in 1613, we have a marvellous document. Now, I don't know if you remember when my colleague Matt Hancock, anyone remember Matt Hancock? Matt Hancock was injudicious enough to give his collected WhatsApp messages to the most indiscreet woman in England. This is a woman called Isabel Oakeshott. And amongst them were a number of WhatsApp messages that proved to be highly embarrassing to Matt. And they gave that wonderful sense that you so rarely have, that you've actually seen right into the heart of how government is actually working, how these little jealousies and intrigues are being developed. And wonderfully, we have exactly the same thing in 1613. We have a WhatsApp message equivalent, which is from Francis Bacon to James I. And it is entitled, without a great deal of subtlety, Reasons for the Remove of Coke. Reasons why it should be exceeding much for His Majesty's service to remove the Lord Coke from Chief Justice of England and the attorney to succeed him, and, get this, the solicitor, the attorney. You can see what he's doing. And then first it will strengthen the king's causes greatly amongst the judges, for my Lord Coke will think himself near a privy councillor's place and thereupon turn obsequious. Well, we never see that. We never see people turn obsequious in the face of a potential preferment in modern politics. And so it's very interesting to see that's happening in the 17th century. Secondly, the now solicitor is like to recover that strength to the king's prerogative which he had in times past and which is due unto it, i.e., that's going to be me when I've become attorney. Thirdly, the remove of my Lord Coke to a place of less profit will be thought abroad a discipline to him for opposing himself in the king's causes. This guy's been getting right up the king's nose, and not only that, up the archbishop's nose as well. Neither of them is very happy about it. The example of whereof will contain others in more awe. Lastly, this will appear to be the king's own act to the king's infinite honour. Well, you can see how James I would have reacted to that. And I had a very distinguished lawyer suggest that this actually, we have no evidence that actually, and it's true, this is a draft rather than the final document. But since James does exactly this, I think we can be fairly sure that it's pretty dispositive, as you lawyers say. So we have a sense of what it is to look right into the intrigue and just see that moment of machination when Bacon is trying to get rid of this hated rival of his. And the king then does this. The king moves Cook from the place he loves, and by the way, the place of greatest remuneration, and a very surprising thought amongst this company, I know, which is the Court of Common Pleas, to the Court of King's Bench, which is less remunerative and sitting right underneath the king's nose. And so that's designed to, it's a brilliant little sally. It has the effect of disabling Cook, bringing him under the king's, kind of closer to the king's supervision. It's ostensibly a promotion. He's going to come near a Privy Councillor's place, and at the same time, it engineers a route forward for Bacon himself. And of course, since the king is now, having worked his way through a number of other personal favourites, creating and then destroying them, is now firmly ensconced, or getting firmly ensconced fairly shortly in 1616 or so, with George Villiers, later to be the Duke of Buckingham. You will get a sense as to, and since Villiers has been getting some private coaching on the art of statecraft from one Francis Bacon, you can see why he's thinking, hold on a second, this is all suddenly, you know, we didn't have a great 1590s, but everything's now suddenly starting to really rock. And you've probably been following the Sky series, George and Mary, all about George Villiers, or if you haven't, you've been rushing out to buy my friend Lucy Hughes-Hallett's book on George Villiers. I won't talk about Villiers, but believe me, the book, I love the book, but it's not, he was not a scapegoat. George Villiers brought everything he had on himself. He was not in any sense, in any serious way, a scapegoat. Anyway, there you have it. I've probably got, what, about another 10 minutes, Donald?
Oh, yes.
Should we bring this home in about 10 minutes, and then you can ask any questions you like, and we'll run on as long as you like. So, Cook then, in 1616, Bacon is able to engineer an outright confrontation in the Privy Council between Cook and the king. And Cook is sent away, removed from his position, sent away, and invited in a kind of classic act familiar from communist Eastern Europe to examine his errors and consider a spot of recantation. And Cook, being the kind of man he is, then retreats, does some thinking, comes back with a tiny scrawled paper with 5 minuscule mistakes, which he prides himself as fewer than were found in Plowden's own reports, and it's promptly and firmly cashiered. And that, you might think, is the end of Cook, if it wasn't for the fact that we're in a kind of Terminator-like world in which everyone has afterlives that you wouldn't imagine. So cutting a quite engaged, intricate story short, Cook then does exactly what you would expect any genuinely ambitious man to do, who could in the early years of the 17th century. That is, he attempts successfully to win himself back into favour with the king by essentially selling his daughter to the idiot brother of George Villiers, John Villiers. Because he's worked out that George Villiers, Steenie, the king's favourite, is right next to the king's affections. He shows an appetite for government, seems apparently no interest in going. King doesn't seem to have any interest in getting rid of him, nor does he. And he's got this idiotic brother, John, and I'm afraid to say that Cook has a lovely daughter called Frances, and he decides to give her with an enormous amount of money in order to secure his return. This is successful. Cook's wife, with whom he's been fighting for the previous 15 years, goes crazy with grief, attempts to enlist Francis Bacon in the process, because Bacon is at that point, I guess, well, I forget what he is at that point. He might be Lord Keeper at that point, but he's certainly pretty senior. And he then, that all fails. Cook wins on that, and it's another turn. It's another Winding Stair has wound another notch. And so you end up with a situation in which Cook is now at that point back in favour. He's not a judge anymore. That's it when it comes to judging. But he's now setting his sights on becoming Lord Treasurer, or one of the big jobs. And we then, in that context, enter we get to the 1621 Parliament. Now, 1621 Parliament, as you will recall from your intimate familiarity with early 17th century history, is the Parliament in which, miraculously, against all expectation, Francis Bacon, having entered it with a tremendous head of steam, the king's got himself into some terrible trouble overseas because of his daughter and her husband. It's the beginning of what will prove to be the 30 Years' War. The king's very careful attempts to secure peace across for Britain and her neighbours is starting to come unstuck. And that means he's going to have to raise some money. And that means, having had tremendously fraught relationships with Parliament, he's going to have to call another Parliament. The last Parliament, 1614, the one that ended in 1614, was a total disaster. This one, however, has been very carefully planned by Bacon with a group of other key figures, including Edward Coke. They've buried their differences. They're going to try and get the 1621 Parliament over the line. King needs the money. They're going to fund, a proper Protestant army to go over and kind of duff up the Catholic Continentals. So the 1621 Parliament begins at the very end of January. But before it begins, Francis Bacon has a 60th birthday party at York House, which is the Lord Keeper's house. He is at that point Lord Chancellor. He's got to the top of the Winding Stair, and he gives an enormous dinner, and his grandness is now, his greatness is now so great, his grandness is now so grand that that includes a poem which we still have, which is an ode to York House, celebrating Bacon as its most brilliant and distinguished inhabitant. So that's at the end of January 1621, and within about 8 weeks, Bacon has been totally destroyed. He's been totally destroyed. Now, I'm not going to lay out the intricate methods or way in which this happens, but broadly speaking, his entire strategy for the Parliament starts to come under immediate attack, and very soon it becomes clear that he has given some advice in relation to patents, which are essentially ways of extorting money from people, and these have been abused. And then it turns out that he's potentially been in receipt of payments for bribery, and suddenly it's getting very close to the king and Buckingham, and they don't want any of that stuff, so they give him up. And Bacon instantly falls from grace. Now, this was regarded, and it's still in many ways, is regarded by academics as a completely inexplicable act. They've brought this in. No one could have anticipated this. Bacon was riding high. He was organised. The Parliament was set fair. He was Lord Chancellor. The King, was reframing the relationship with Parliaments. It was all going to be thoroughly excellent. And this was a completely inexplicable and completely unexpected event. And so what I do in the book is to suggest an alternative interpretation. And I'm not going to give that to you now. You're going to have to buy the book. But it is an interpretation which has Edward Coke at the absolute centre of it. I'm waiting actually for that moment where the Historical Journal just call me up and say, would you please make this into an article, for our readers, because I think it is actually a view of the Parliament that has never been properly and fully explored. Okay, let me say a couple of things about achievements. What we have here is essentially a process of almost 30 years of rivalry. Now, but it's not just about rivalry, right? It's not just about, and the rivalry is really gets going, but it's not just about rivalry. It's also about the ambition, the desire to be something and to do something, to make a great name for oneself, to do great public service. On both sides, I don't think one can. I mean, Coke is a more obviously upright figure than Bacon, but I don't think one can disavow those ambitions for Bacon at all. Bacon has the idea of a new Inn of Court, dare I say it, in the 1590s. By the time you get to 1605, the advancement of learning, that's developed into a conception of what we would now talk about and think of as a research university. Just imagine that. We didn't have any other. We didn't. The research universities in England, in Oxford and Cambridge, are seminaries for the education of clerics, by and large. So the idea of a research university, the idea then that thought in advancement and gets developed via the Novum Organum 1620 into a spreading conception of an empirical turn in our entire view of the world, where we move away from Aristotle as refined through a Aquinean Thomistic rationalizing view of the world into the Aristotle of as it were, natural philosophy, and in investigating the world and tabulating and exploring how things actually are, and then basing a kind of scientific worldview on that. That's just an astounding achievement. That's an amazing thing, and I think something that commands our attention. The essays are also, I think, an extraordinary achievement. Let me just read you some of the epithet. I mean, the essays, again, very much repay study now. I would encourage everyone to come back to them. So here are some of Baconian lines. Mean men in their rising must adhere, but great men that have strengthened themselves were better to maintain themselves indifferent and neutral. That is a sentence. Those are that, if I may say so. That is one sentence. If there was one sentence that explained why I'm no good in politics, it is that sentence. Okay, I'm just hopeless at maintaining myself indifferent and neutral. If I think something's no good, I'm apt to say it. It's a terrible mistake in politics. To spend too much time in studies, Bacon says, is sloth. To use them too much for ornament is affectation. To make judgment wholly by their rules is the humour of a scholar. So that's quite interesting. This one I love. A man is apt to discover virtue after vice has ceased to pay him. Some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, some few to be chewed and digested. So this is Bacon. Now come to Cook. What have we got? We've got incredible achievements. You've got the reports. Amazing volume, systematic compilation of Cook's own cases and other, to almost a kind of periodic table of elements that we go back to in thinking about the great early cases in the modern, but in a way that is, I would suggest, in a certain way, distinctively modern, compiled, assembled, very much advancing a view of the law tacitly as they go. The rehabilitation of Magna Carta. Obviously, Cook, outside the period I've just discussed, but obviously writes the Institute's entire volume dedicated to interpretation of Magna Carta. That's much earlier. John's done some brilliant work on the notebooks which show how heavily embedded in thinking about Magna Carta Cook is, and indeed William Cecil had been, and others. But Magna Carta in the 1580s is nothing like the thing it is in the 1610s and 20s. And Cook is an extraordinarily important, let alone the prestige that it achieves after that. Remarkable kind of reorientation. Of course, you've got the judgments. I've talked about prohibitions, proclamations, Bonham's case. The one of course, that they collaborated on, Calvin's case. There are lots and lots and lots of judgments, cases in which he's worked, and these are, you may or may not think that judicial review in America comes from Bonham's case, but you can be certain that everyone who talks about it refers back to that case. You may have noted that in the prorogation judgment, the Gina Miller case prorogation judgment, the Supreme Court manages to reference what it describes as the case of proclamations. The case of proclamations 1610. Of course, it wasn't a decision by a court at all. It was a private judgment amongst the judges that was never published. I think they give it the wrong date as well. So apart from that, it's doing a lot of fine work. It's not being used for authority, it's just being used as a bit of folderol. But it's still interesting that they find it important to go there. And above all, you have this conception of the common law as a spreading and consistent volume of law, precedent-based, judge-made law, pushing out these into these areas that might be, councils of the north and the law they try to make, or they might be the clerical courts. The idea of that single kind of sense of a collective body of law, and that somehow being the law of the land, something comes out of a kind of engagement with particular cases in the land. Of course, often they are property cases, so specifically of the land. And then the idea of artificial reason. The king, the lawyers, the judges, very special expertise that comes from kind of understanding, somehow detecting the underlying direction and reflection of a body of authorities. I think precedence isn't quite the right word for this time of this period, but authorities, I think, is a better word. So those things are absolutely foundational, and of course it is no surprise when you think of that Cook then, outside the period of this book, then becomes such an extraordinarily influential figure in the run-up and the writing of the Petition of Right. As my wife says, Petition of Right, 1628, and that itself is an extraordinarily important constitutional document in a way that completely unrecognised today, as indeed Cook is unrecognised today. And of course, what do we get out of the 1621 Parliament? Well, we get the rehabilitation of the idea of impeachment. We get the concept of a much bigger boost to the idea of parliamentary accountability. So ministers somehow being accountable to Parliament, not to the king. We get that a change, you might think, coming from the beginning actually of those early 17th century parliaments, a change in the temper, the sense of what Parliament is about, what it is for, no longer under the Queen's thumb, but rancorous, squabbling, difficult, inconsistent, and in some sense pre-democratic. Let me stop there, draw a line, and thank you very much indeed for having me along.
Jesse, thank you so much for what was obvious to anybody here was a complete tour de force, which could only have been embarked upon by drawing on a huge reservoir of knowledge and study that you didn't even begin to tap this evening. And that's why you actually need to read the book.
Do what this man says.
There is much more in the book than Jesse was able to cover this evening, and it is well worth reading. Now, Jesse's agreed to take some questions, and I think Sir Ivan Lawrence is going to ask the first one. Can you wait till you get the microphone, because then it will go on the...
While Sir Ivan is waiting, can I just give you one tiny tease, which is some of the things that I said were by Bacon were actually by me. See if you can guess which ones.
Can I tempt you onto another subject? Bacon, being a Gray's man, was more corrupt, obviously, than Cook, who was an Inner Temple man. And this must have been known to Queen Elizabeth. And one of the subjects that really agonized the Tudors was the suggestion that Henry VII would have murdered the two princes in the Tower. And Richard III was a very popular man in his time. And so it was always unlikely that Richard III would have been the murderer, and always more likely that Henry VII was the killer of the two in the Tower. Now, at some stage, somebody must have said to Bacon, probably the Queen, if you want to advance in my court, then why don't you, with your brilliant literary powers, write something which vilifies Richard III and clears Henry Tudor from the murder of the princes in the Tower, from which all the Tudor succession follows. And along comes Bacon with a book which is the basis of Shakespeare's text, vilifying Richard III. And as a corrupt man, he must have expected advancement. Is there any evidence that he did advance as a result of reinterpreting history to help the Tudors against the dishonest attempt to say that Richard of York was the murderer?
Sir Ivan, what a fantastic question, and I hugely look forward to your novel exploring that tantalizing possibility. I don't think there is any evidence. Well, first of all, I'm fairly certain there's no evidence that the Queen ever commissioned such a work, let alone on that basis. But it is and I admire your distinctive conception of causation in the law, that it's Bacon's status as a Gray's man that creates this corrupt disposition.
Well, he was corrupt. He got convicted.
The point has been made, and he undoubtedly fell foul of the authorities at the end of his life, and I don't think there's any doubt that he was guilty as charged, although the standards were very different then. No, I think I don't think there's any reason to think that that this is anything more than a wonderful speculation. But I'm absolutely ready to be corrected, and there may be people in this room who can do so, and I would invite them to do that.
When they found Richard III in the car park, in the Tesco's car park in Leicester, he did have a crooked back.
Yeah. The Henry VII book was written much later in his career.
So
he'd got nothing from the Queen other than the empty title of QC, Queen's Counsel. She wouldn't actually literally give him a job, but she, to satisfy him, she created Queen's Counsel for him.
The problem that Bacon had was that the Queen knew how to measure someone's worth to the ounce, and she decided he wasn't a good one. That was the thing. But of course, that's right. So,
in Josephine Tay's book, she says that Richard couldn't be guilty because otherwise the Tudors would have attained him. There would have been a bill of attainder accusing him of the murder, and there isn't. Well, I had a look into this and discovered that there is in fact a bill of attainder which accuses Richard of shedding infant's blood.
well, this is not a topic on which I know very much of anything. So I congratulate you on your. I mean, it is quite important to test some of these points made in books, and I'm very grateful to you for pointing out that you've done so.
There's a little off-piste, I think, for Jesse this evening.
No. Well, I'm perfectly happy to confess my ignorance on an almost indefinite range of topics.
Of course, I think Thomas More had certainly beaten Bacon to accusing Richard III. But now, yes, here, please.
Anything that I found surprising in research? I mean, I think, of course, surprise, when you arrive at a topic with as pure a sense of ignorance as I did, almost everything is surprising. And therefore, I didn't come to this as, I'm not a historian I'm not I read classics as an undergraduate, and then my graduate work was in philosophy. So this was all a process of investigation and review and consideration and digestion. And so from that point of view, it's hard to distinguish between surprise or not. I suppose, I mean, you know, I suppose I was slightly surprised by the lack of attention that's given to the period more widely, which is a very, very interesting period. And, you know, scholars inevitably, particularly in academia these days, which has become ever more specific and particular, and where enormous amounts of work have been done, particularly in county archives. You know, what you're looking at, you know, I'm surprised we don't have that extra level of understanding of what's going on in this period compared to, for example, in the 1640s, where we've absolutely poured all over everything that could possibly be known about it. So that's just a kind of procedural point, really. Yeah, I mean, I was surprised to read the reasons for the remove of Cook. I mean, that was a wonderful discovery. I mean, it's very well known amongst scholars, but still wonderful for someone as ignorant as me to discover it. If you've got a microphone, I think you're next up. Yes, you have the conch.
I do. You said quite early on that Cook became known as an oracle of the law early.
Yes.
So I'd like to ask you how, you know, what did he do? What was the way he studied? What set him off to compile all those institutes and laws? And there's a second part, although this is not quite so connected, is, you know, I have read your book and I loved it.
Oh, how lovely. Thank you very much.
Bit of a plug there, but do read it. But he doesn't come across as a nicer or better person than Bacon. Or not in my reading of it.
I'm not sure that's quite true. I think.
I wonder how you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about corruption is getting at something. I mean, people.
No, I'm talking about him as an individual, his character. I suppose.
No, yes,
his treatment of his daughter.
but I think the thing about Bacon is, I mean, everyone, well, not everyone, it was an understood fact about Bacon that he was quite a slippery figure and character. And, you know, there are very clever people who have a kind of labile quality to them, and he may have been like that. Cook is a more direct and often brusque and rough around the edges. And I mean, you know, there are moments where you can certainly suspect. I mean, you know, there's a famous trial of Walter Raleigh when Cook is hectoring Raleigh and actually, you know, withholds evidence, and that would never survive any investigation by a modern court. And so we might have some pretty choice words to say about his personal morality on that front. But I think Cook is in general, a more upright and stronger figure. And you know, one of the rules in general in politics is that you judge people by what they're prepared to give up to achieve. And you know, when Cook comes back with 5 small changes and a desire to, you know, to a delight that hits fewer than Plowden, what he's really doing is giving the finger to the king. Now you've got to be, that's it's not hard to get your head chopped off doing that. So that speaks to tremendous strength of personality and independence of mind and belief in, frankly, the law. And I think that speaks incredibly well of him. As regards his working practices, just about 12 feet from you, behind you, to your left, is a man who's forgotten more about this than I'll ever know, John Baker. So, I mean, he's written a brilliant book on Cook and Magna Carta, and there are other books. There's quite a good book about the young Cook, which talks about how he makes his early life in the law. We don't have an enormous amount of evidence about it, as far as I'm aware, that it's become, as it were, publicly understood. But I mean, you know, John will be able to tell us how much more there is to be done or could be done.
Oh, gentleman there.
I was wondering, is there any suggestion that when James became king, with his particular characteristics and tastes, as you've described, that Bacon caught on to that, and well, the word pander springs to mind. Did he show a sympathy for that chosen lifestyle and his favourites, and therefore curry favour?
I'm not aware of anything there, it's really important not to read back kind of contemporary views about homosexuality or about kind of sexual relationships and the nature of sexual relations. I mean, James was a very, very unusual person, and the language that he uses, he refers to his relation, he refers to himself as daddy in relation to Buckingham, but also, almost every other kind of familial relationship, wife, it's a very, very unusual and odd place. Now, we don't know anything about Bacon's sexuality. Nothing would have pleased me more in a different world to send Bacon down to Southwark for a bit of rough trade by the theatres, but there's no evidence for it. There's no evidence for it. And I took a view that I'm afraid it wasn't the job of this book to do anything for which I couldn't be rationally certain that either I knew it was true or it wouldn't materially change the historical record. I mean, there are a few things that I've kind of invented, as I've mentioned, but they don't really change. I have a wooing scene. So if you read the paperback version of the book, there's an afterword in it in which I talk about where some of the bodies are buried in the book. Did you notice the line from the Blues Brothers, which is a film, in case you're not aware? Have you spotted the P.G. Wodehouse parody? I mean, that kind of stuff. And you can do that with a novel. But of course, that doesn't affect, and it's specifically structured not to affect our historical understanding of what's going on. So we do know that in the particular parody I'm talking about, which is the wooing scene between Bacon and his mother. Well, actually, I could give you a bit of that. Should we have a bit of Bacon and his mother, just for a second? Mother-in-law, I think you might enjoy it. Let's just have 2 minutes of Bacon. The visitor is announced, and Lady Packington is all graciousness. Sir Francis. She's rather like Prunella Scales, as you may have detected in 40 Towers. Sybil 40. Sir Francis, I must confess I do like the sound of that. It hath a lovely ring to it. Can it be that our sweet Alice hath brought you back to our little house in town? We are honoured. I will have her brought to you now. Francis is in pursuit of a wife. Alice is Alice Barnum, daughter of the late Benedict Barnum, alderman, and then sheriff at London himself, a ton of alderman and Sheriff Francis Barnum. And then they go for a walk. The birds sing, the bees buzz, the trees rustle in the slanting sunlight of a glorious late September day. They walk in the gardens behind the house, Lady Packington hovering behind. Alice, I hope you are well. I am, sir. Oh, she is wondrous well. Sir Francis. Truly she cometh on day by day, almost to say blooming, I would venture, as you may see for yourself. It proceeds like this. I'm not doing anything. I'm not doing any violence to the character of Dorothy Packington, who is one of these amazing women in the book. Dorothy Packington's first husband was a gent. Her second husband was a baron. Her second husband was a knight. Her third husband was a baron, and her fourth husband was an earl. That gives you a sense of what you had to be in order to get on as a woman in Stuart England. So I don't have there's no lack of sympathy there. But it just gives you a sense of how one can play with the genre without doing any fundamental violence to the history, I hope.
Well, just one more question. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'll be quick if you want to ask another one. Because there's a lady at the back as well, if you want.
I haven't yet read The Winding Stair, but I have read your biography of Edmund Burke, and I wanted to know what differences and similarities you found between writing about historical figures in a sort of straightforward historical biography and in fiction, like you've done with The Winding Stair.
Where to begin? You'll enjoy the afterword to the Winding Stair, which talks a bit about
It's
this.
my birthday tomorrow, and I asked for it as a present.
Okay,
so
well, what a hero! We just love you. Thank you. I mean, there is a connection which is worth just talking about. So Burke, in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, talks very much about the British Constitution in terms of this very Cookean idea of the ancient constitution. That is the idea of a constitution that predated the conquest, and therefore captured a notion of law which was superior. So it was doing some polemical work for him, superior to kingship. And that's a very important connecting thread. And when you think of Burke's view of society as an embedded wisdom, which is to be passed on to the next generation in a relationship of trust, that's very, very, very close to a common law conception of this way in which accumulated experiences gathered into a body of thought in law to be detected by artificial reason. Small grace note for Baconians. I think there's a failure in Bacon to appreciate an empirical counterpart to artificial reason, which is why he never makes that breakthrough to mathematics on the empirical side. Sorry, yes, very quick to that lady, because otherwise I'll feel very bad about not including her. Sorry.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you for letting me put the last question. And the reference to the lady at the back, and actually the lady at the back is the context of the question I want to put to you. You have mentioned a number of wondrous women that have been described by either Cook or Bacon, and the respect that certain women had at that time. But we also know that during this period, of course, the law on petty treason was operative, and women who killed husbands, even those who abused them, were then hanged and burnt at the stake during this period. I wonder whether you've come across in your research anything that Coke, or rather Cook, and Francis Bacon had to say on this in the various papers that you've been consulting.
Well, the answer to that is there's nothing that comes to my mind, and of course, the treatment of, I mean, there's so many different things to be said about this, but the treatment of women with property and women without property is in many ways radically different, and the treatment of obviously this language, we're not really getting into the language of witchcraft, but we have had the language of witchcraft used, and it will come again, and that is often really only applied to kind of poorer, older women. So there are lots of different aspects of a kind of the picture, not all of them by any means straightforwardly misogynistic, quite the opposite. I mean, it is one of the extraordinary things is that there are laws that protect the property of wives, and the law of trusts emerges from some of that law, I think I'm right in saying, and that's a rather extraordinary kind of development. So it's not by any means a monochrome picture, but it is certainly one, and of course, I mean, yes, I would say this, I'm married to Kate Bingham, but I mean, behind every incompetent man, there's an effective and successful woman, and that turns out to be true here as well.
Well, thank you very much. But before I absolutely round up, can I just mention, we've had referred to several times Professor Sir John Baker, who's in the audience this evening. You might be interested to know that some years ago, Sir John found hiding in plain sight in the British Library Cook's notebooks, annotated by Cook, and they were referred to briefly by Jessie. The Selden Society has been publishing those books slowly in very recent times, and the final volumes, the final 3 volumes, will be available by the end of May. Members of the Selden Society, if they're current members of the Selden Society, will receive those volumes as part of their membership subscription, which is staggeringly low. It's about £50 or something like that. And as members of the Selden Society, they would also be entitled to buy, at the cost of postage only, these beautifully bound earlier volumes. So all 8 volumes at virtually no money would be available to you if you chose to join the Selden Society and requested those volumes. They consist of the notebooks edited and explained by Sir John as no other living scholar could possibly do, and are absolutely fascinating. The introductions alone are worth reading with care, and I would really commend the thought of going on to the Selden Society website and thinking of joining at this stage, because the volumes are so unique, so informative, and a work of tremendous scholarship.
Could I add one very quick thing on just a polemical thing of that? It's absolutely characteristic of working lawyers to think of old cases that are outside the penumbra as somehow merely antiquarian. And broadly speaking, the older a case is, the less its current authority is. These are works of great genius in their composition and in their commentary. And I think absolutely worth joining the society for, absolutely worth kind of developing one's own historical sense. One doesn't need to use it in the courtroom or in giving advice, but a tremendous value.
Yeah, thank you. I agree entirely. Thank you. So, anyhow, Jessie, what a privilege to have you come and talk to us. We're enormously grateful. You have indicated that you will come to the reception afterwards, and I'm sure there are lots of people who would like to come and talk to you during the course of that reception. So let me not keep people away from the wine in the reception, which takes place just through those doors there. But thank you again so much. And if you've got a pen, could you sign my copy? That'd be awesome. Hello, I'm sorry, I was not grandfather.